On the Nationalism and Revolution unit, we're going to be focusing on Latin America. So we're moving away from Europe now and focusing on another part of the world, and that is Latin America, right? And Latin America includes the Spanish-speaking parts of the Western Hemisphere. So really from Mexico south into South America and the Caribbean islands. So it's all part of this Latin American region we're talking about. And so while things definitely vary from different parts of that land to others, because again, that's a huge piece of territory. We're talking about Mexico all the way down to the tip of South America. But there are some common things that developed in this region. And the main reason for that is because almost all this land, almost all of it, was controlled by Spain, right? And then a part of it, modern day Brazil, was controlled by Portugal. And so the social structure that those groups brought with them was put into place throughout the entire part of this region of the world. And so something important to understand is the social structure that existed in Latin America in the 19th century, which is the 1800s. So at the highest end of the social status, we have peninsulares, and you can see there the Spanish word for peninsula, which refers back to Spain, right? Because Spain is and Portugal are on the Iberian Peninsula. So if you were peninsulares, that means you were a native of Spain, and that you were born and you grew up there, and you now live in Latin America, in the New World. Most of these people were kind of the nobility, so to speak, the ones who were in charge of the government, wealthy landowners, things like that. That's who we're talking about. However, we do know that, as early as the 1500s, you have the Spanish are settling and colonizing in what is now Latin America. And so by this point in the 1800s, you have generations of people for centuries, ethnically Spanish people were living in Latin America. And so another group that was pretty high up and could be pretty well integrated with the Peninsulares were the Creoles. If you guys ever heard of that word before, you might think of, in Haiti they speak Creole. It's kind of a form of French. But in this sense, what it means, it's European-blooded people, so people who are fully Spanish descent, but who were born and grew up in Latin America. So they are fully Spanish. They don't have any Native American. They don't have any African blood in them. They are pure Spanish or Portuguese. So those two make the kind of the highest ranking levels of society at this time. Underneath them, you have the mestizos, and the mestizos are Spanish people of mixed Spanish and Native American ancestry. That was a pretty common mix. The Spanish, unlike the English, when they came to the New World, kind of intermarried and had relationships with a lot of the indigenous populations, whereas the English kind of kept to themselves in that regard for the most part. And so you have a pretty mixed race society in Latin America. However, just because it was kind of more acceptable to do that does not necessarily mean that everyone was on equal footing. Mestizos were often seen as kind of below these purebred, quote unquote purebred Spaniards. But they could also be kind of wealthy or successful depending on what they did, if they were mixed blood. Towards the much lower of the chain were what we would call mulattoes, and this is kind of a term that would seem outdated now, but was used to describe people who are of mixed European and African blood. So that mixed race, they were kind of seen at the bottom. And underneath them, of course, were the kind of the purebred Indians who were pure colonial subjects, and anyone who was enslaved. And so that's kind of the structure we have in place in Latin America when we get to the 19th century, when we get into this period of nationalism and revolution in the 1830s. Actually, in Latin America, it's a little bit before in a lot of places. Right, so we mentioned before who controlled this territory. Overwhelmingly, it is Spain and Portugal. Mexico, at a certain point, is actually controlled by France because it's part of Napoleon's empire. In 1808, remember we talked about the Peninsular War. He invades Spain. So there's some handing over of power in parts of Latin America. And there's a revolution, though. Lots of revolutions begin to happen in the early 1800s in Latin America, right? Because they had been for years and decades, centuries, arguably unsatisfied or dissatisfied with Spanish rule, especially the Creoles, who believed they were of equal footing but not treated as so, and the mestizos, who also they were mixed blood, so they kind of understood why they were seen as less than. But didn't think they should be. And so when Spain is kind of preoccupied with what's going on at home in Spain with France and Napoleon, they begin to take advantage of this weakened Spanish state and try to gain independence. And kind of the main figure to associate with these revolutions in Latin America at this time is a man named Simon Bolivar. Bolivar was this leading revolutionary figure. He was well educated. He was part of that Creole class, so Spanish descent, but living in born and raised in this part of the world. And just like the revolutionaries throughout Europe, right, these Enlightenment ideas that inspired them also inspire Bolivar and his followers, right? They want republican governments in Latin America. And his dream was to create a nation known as Gran Colombia. And this would be encompass the territory that now includes several different countries, including Colombia, Panama, Venezuela, and Ecuador, right? So he wanted to control all this land under one republican government known as Gran Colombia. He was ultimately unsuccessful in creating this one united nation, but he was successful in helping to lead revolutions that led to independence. So while he doesn't have this final dream of one united country, we do have independent countries that form as a direct result of his efforts, his military and political efforts. In addition to Bolivar in Latin America, we also have some other independence movements that are successful. In the earliest one, actually, is Haiti, this island nation of Haiti, which is on the island of Hispaniola, which is one of the first islands that Columbus actually helped settle and colonize. But Haiti was actually the first country, aside from America, in the Western Hemisphere to gain independence, and they happened, a couple decades after American independence. In 1804, you have the formation of Haiti. The main revolutionary leader of that is an African named Toussaint Louverture. So he clearly has a French-inspired name there, but he was of African descent. And really, essentially, what the revolution in Haiti was predominantly a slave revolt. The large black population of the island was kind of being controlled and subjugated by the few, white French settlers that lived there, and so they revolt and successfully defeat the French here, and they gained their independence in 1804. A couple of years later, in 1821, you have Mexico achieving their independence, and that's led by a Catholic priest. Actually, is one of the key figures leading that. And his name is Father Miguel Hidalgo. And so Mexico has this kind of complicated relationship with the Catholic Church. At times, the Catholic Church is led by revolutionary figures like Hidalgo, who are very much associated with the ordinary people and kind of praised and glorified. And then there's times when the Catholic Church is very much aligned with the government in power. And so then some of the ordinary people, kind of have distrust of the church. So there's that back and forth that happens in Mexico. But Father Miguel Hidalgo is one of the figures that helps to lead to the Mexican independence. Other Catholic priests are also actually important in this as well. In 1822, we actually have the independence of another nation, but this one's not gaining their independence from Spain, but from the nation of Portugal, and that is Brazil. So again, Brazil is unique in Latin America because they actually speak Portuguese there, not Spanish. And so they gained their independence in 1822. So the Latin America of 1830 is very different than the Latin America of 1800. As you can see on the left-hand side, the green shaded area is all the territory that was controlled by Spain, the yellow by Portugal, and then you have a few smaller territories controlled by the British and the Dutch and French. Fast forward 30 years, right, and it looks totally different. You have all the color, the purple coloring there are all independent nations. You can see Mexico, right, and parts of the original Mexican state was actually the southwest of the United States. California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, all used to be part of Mexico. And that's all pretty much independent with a few exceptions. If you see here, a few exceptions in the islands in the Caribbean, like Cuba and Dominican Republic, Santo Domingo, as well as a few nations here, pieces of territory here on South America. This map on the right also shows the kind of political movements, militaristic movements, I should say, of Simon Bolivar and another man, Jose de San Martin, and he was another revolutionary fighter. And these kind of those red dots there in South America are all the major battles. So you have one up in Colombia, in Venezuela, and Ecuador, and down in Buenos Aires and Santiago as well. All these different battles for the independence of these colonies. This man Jose de San Martin was another one of these revolutionary leaders who fought primarily in Chile and Argentina, and then which are these countries here where my mouse are. All right, and then Bolivar was more kind of in the northern part of South America, right? Ecuador and Venezuela and Colombia in this area here. So they were kind of two people, at times working together, but not necessarily aligned entirely, working to achieve this independence. And so while we have lots of revolutions going on in Europe during this time period, some of them are successful, like in Greece and Serbia, for example, but most are not successful. Here in Latin America, almost all of them are successful. By 1830, we have almost complete independence. Spain has very few colonies left in what was once known as the New World. And so they have a kind of much more successful experience with this movement. And again, it's all inspired by this idea of nationalism, right? They saw themselves as a nation of people that were not Spanish, right? They spoke Spanish, they had some Spanish blood, but they had this indigenous culture, this Native American culture as well. And they wanted to kind of rule themselves and not be ruled by a monarchy that was 3,000 or 4,000 miles away.